This story delves into the life of Adolf Hitler, a figure whose shadow still looms large over the 20th century. It is a long-form, information-rich historical narrative aimed at an American audience, exploring the surprising and complex path from a failed artist to the architect of the Holocaust and World War II. The Ghost of Brauna, a historical narrative of Adolf Hitler. Part 1. The Making of the Monster, 1889 to 1919. The most terrifying figures in history often emerge from the most mundane beginnings. Adolf Hitler, the man who would plunge the world into a conflict costing tens of millions of lives and orchestrate the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, was not born a demon, but a boy in the quiet Austrian border town of Brauna am Inn on April 20th, 1889. The narrative of his early life, often obscured by the monumental evil he later committed, is a critical study in how a personality is warped by circumstance, resentment, and a profound sense of personal failure. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, an illegitimate child who would eventually legalize the surname Hitler, a variant of Heidler or Schicklgruber, the name he was born with. Alois was a harsh, authoritarian patriarch who demanded that his son follow him into the civil service. Young Adolf, a mediocre student with a penchant for high-minded, undisciplined dreams, harbored a burning ambition to become an artist. This fundamental clash defined much of his youth. The beatings he endured and the constant pressure from his father, a man he both feared and resented, instilled in him a deep-seated contempt for authority figures who did not align with his own, ultimately grandiose visions. The death of Alois in 1903, and more traumatically the passing of his beloved, doting mother, Clara, in 1907, left the 18-year-old Adolf adrift, financially unstable, and spiritually unmoored. The next 5 years, spent primarily in Vienna, were a crucible. This was not the struggle of a noble artist suffering for his craft, but a period of abject failure. He applied to the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice and was rejected both times. The Academy's critique was damning. He had some architectural talent, but his paintings lacked humanity and technical skill, particularly in depicting the human form. The rejection, however, was not internalized as a lack of talent, but as a conspiracy by the cultural elite. Living a precarious existence in men's hostels, selling cheap watercolor postcards of Viennese landmarks to survive, Hitler was an isolated, proud, and increasingly embittered young man. It was in this environment of poverty and intellectual drift that the seeds of his monstrous ideology were nourished. Vienna, a city of vibrant culture and profound social tensions, was a hotbed of nationalist and anti-Semitic rhetoric, much of it promoted by figures like the populist mayor Karl Lueger. For Hitler, this anti-Jewish ideology provided a convenient, all-encompassing scapegoat for his own failures and the perceived ills of society. The Jewish people became, in his mind, the literal personification of everything he hated: modernity, cosmopolitanism, abstract art, financial capitalism, and the socialist movements he saw undermining the Austrian state. When World War I erupted in August 1914, it was, for the 25-year-old Hitler, a profound moment of salvation. The war was a release from his aimless, impoverished existence. He volunteered for the Bavarian Army, despite being an Austrian national, and found in military service the structure, camaraderie, and clear purpose he had never experienced. As a dispatch runner on the front lines, Hitler was an exemplary, if unusual, soldier. He was continuously on the front lines, displayed remarkable bravery, and was twice awarded the Iron Cross, first class and second class, the former a rare decoration for a corporal. The war's end, however, shattered this new identity. While recovering from a mustard gas attack that temporarily blinded him, he received news of Germany's surrender, the November Revolution, and the creation of the Weimar Republic. For Hitler, the armistice of November 11, 1918, was not a cessation of conflict, but an act of betrayal, a stab in the back perpetrated by socialists, pacifists, and above all, the Jews. This narrative of national humiliation and betrayal became the central, explosive engine of his political life. He chose to remain in the post-war German army, which in 1919 assigned him to an intelligence unit tasked with monitoring and influencing emerging political groups in Munich. In September 1919, he infiltrated a tiny, obscure organization called the German Workers' Party, DAP. At his first meeting, his ferocious, impassioned, and utterly magnetic oratory, a talent he had secretly honed during his solitary years, exploded onto the political stage. He was no longer a failed painter. He was a political prophet, a captivating speaker with a singular, radical message. Within a week, he became a member, and his career as the Führer had begun.
Part 2. The Rise of the Orator, 1920 to 1933. The transformation of the German Workers' Party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, was a process engineered by Hitler's singular drive and his uncanny instinct for propaganda. He was discharged from the army in March 1920 to devote himself full-time to the party. He designed the party's flag, a black swastika in a white circle on a red background, a visual masterpiece of aggressive symbolism intended to stand in stark contrast to the moderate colors of the Weimar Republic. Hitler's political ascent was not purely ideological, it was theatrical. He meticulously studied the art of mass suggestion. His personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, famously captured Hitler in a series of private photographs taken in the mid-1920s, showing the dictator practicing his dramatic hand gestures, contorting his face into various expressions of rage and conviction, and rehearsing his climactic pauses. This was a man creating a character, the Führer, an embodiment of German resentment and ambition. The economic turmoil that plagued the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s, crippling hyperinflation, and the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles provided the perfect backdrop for his message of national redemption. In 1923, Hitler, prematurely attempting a coup, launched the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. The coup failed, and Hitler was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. His time in prison, however, was a luxury. He received favorable treatment and, more importantly, used the time to dictate his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book was a dense, rambling, but terrifyingly clear blueprint of his worldview, a combination of anti-Semitism, anti-Marxism, ultranationalism, and the need for Lebensraum, living space, in the East. It became the holy text of the Nazi movement, selling millions of copies, though few outside the party took its genocidal passages seriously. Upon his release after just 9 months, Hitler realized power would not be seized through violence, but through the ballot box. He rebuilt the Nazi Party, creating a nationwide, sophisticated political machine. When the Great Depression hit Germany in 1929, the fragile Weimar democracy began to crumble. Unemployment soared to 6 million, and the political center vanished. The Nazi Party's simple, powerful promises, jobs, order, and national pride resonated with a terrified, impoverished populace. The most astonishing part of the story is that Hitler never won a democratic majority. Even at their peak, the Nazis failed to secure more than 37% of the vote. He did not seize power. He was handed it. In January 1933, a cabal of conservative political elites, believing they could control the populist firebrand, persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. They believed him to be a temporary figurehead, a useful tool to restore conservative order and suppress the socialist and communist parties. They were catastrophically wrong. Part 3. The Consolidation of Power, 1933 to 1938. The transition from chancellor to absolute dictator was a whirlwind of ruthless speed. Within weeks of his appointment, the Reichstag fire, blamed by the Nazis on a communist plot, provided the pretext for the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended civil liberties. The Enabling Act, passed a month later under duress and intimidation, effectively granted Hitler dictatorial powers, legally dissolving the Weimar Constitution. Within 6 months, all other political parties were banned. Germany had become a single-party state. But Hitler still faced a threat from within his own ranks. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, or Brown Shirts, the violent paramilitary force that had been the party's shock troops. Led by Ernst Röhm, the 2 million-strong SA demanded a second revolution and integration into the regular German army, a prospect the powerful Army High Command abhorred. In June 1934, in a shocking and decisive move known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had Röhm and hundreds of other SA leaders and political opponents murdered by the Schutzstaffel, or SS. This act appeased the army, cemented Hitler's personal authority, and demonstrated that the Führer's ruthlessness knew no bounds, even against his oldest comrades. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler simply merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, leader. The dictatorship was complete. With absolute power, Hitler began to enact the policies outlined in Mein Kampf. Economically, his regime was initially a success. Massive public works projects, most famously the Autobahn network, and aggressive rearmament put millions back to work. The unemployment crisis was solved, creating a widely felt sense of national revival. This economic miracle was coupled with an obsessive, highly effective public relations campaign. The world media, even in the US, often published surprisingly positive lifestyle profiles of Hitler, portraying him as a charming vegetarian, a country gentleman at his Berchtesgaden mountain retreat, and a dog lover. He adored his German shepherd, Blondie. This carefully crafted image of a benevolent, disciplined leader seeking only to restore Germany's honor successfully masked the state's growing cruelty. The most insidious feature of the regime was its institutionalized anti-Semitism. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped German citizens and rights of them, isolating them legally and socially. This was followed by a relentless series of incremental persecutions, barring Jews from professions, confiscating their businesses, and promoting the systemic violence that culminated in the state-sponsored pogrom of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. The state was methodically preparing its population for the unthinkable. On the international stage, Hitler was equally audacious, successfully challenging the Versailles Treaty with a series of bold, calculated risks. He remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, formed the Axis alliance with Mussolini's Italy, and annexed his native Austria in the Anschluss in 1938. Each time, the Western powers, France and Great Britain, reacted with indecision, preferring a policy of appeasement to confrontation. The Munich Agreement, in which Britain and France ceded the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia to Germany in exchange for a promise of peace for our time, was the final tragic confirmation for Hitler that the West lacked the will to fight. It was a humiliating victory that convinced him that the path to Lebensraum, conquest in the East, was now open.
Part 4. The Global Conflagration, 1939 to 1945. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, after the cynical signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, finally triggered the global war. Hitler had no intention of stopping, and the early years of the war showcased the frightening effectiveness of his new military strategy, blitzkrieg, lightning war.
Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and most shocking of all, France, fell in quick succession. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled the entire European continent, from the English Channel to Poland. The Führer was at the zenith of his power. He had achieved what the Kaiser's army could not, and the German people, forgetting the deprivations of the Weimar years, lauded him as a military genius and a savior. He was a vegetarian, a teetotaler, a non-smoker, and yet his ambition was a drug he consumed endlessly. His decision-making, however, was fundamentally flawed by arrogance and a belief in his own infallible destiny. His two greatest errors were inextricably linked to his core ideology: his hatred of Bolshevism and his hatred of the Jews. First, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, in June 1941, was a massive ideological gamble. Intended as a short, decisive campaign to secure Lebensraum and crush his communist enemy, it was launched against the advice of his generals. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union, coupled with the brutal Russian winter and fierce resistance, turned the Blitzkrieg into a prolonged, savage war of attrition. The war became not just a military conflict, but an ideological, exterminatory struggle between two totalitarian regimes. Second, the invasion of the East also opened the door to the final solution. As the Wehrmacht advanced, special SS killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, followed, systematically murdering Jewish men, women, and children in mass shootings, often burying them in the thousands in the forests of Eastern Europe. This was followed by the decision formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 to industrialize the killing process, the move to the concentration and extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Holocaust, the most monstrous crime in history, was fully underway. It was not a hidden side effect of the war. It was a central ideological goal. For the American audience, the contrast between the European War and the Pacific War is critical. While the U.S. initially focused on Japan after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the strategic decision to defeat Hitler first. The Nazi regime, with its vast ideological threat and superior technological capacity, was the greater danger. The American intervention in North Africa in 1942, followed by the invasion of Italy, and finally the colossal D-Day landings in June 1944, signaled the beginning of the end. As the war turned, Hitler's leadership became increasingly erratic and detached from reality. He became reliant on a cocktail of drugs administered by his personal physician, Theodor Morell, who gave him up to 60 pills a day for various real and imagined ailments. He micromanaged military strategy from his headquarters, refusing to allow retreats and sacrificing entire armies in the name of political symbolism. The July 20 plot in 1944, an attempt by senior officers to assassinate Hitler and seize power, only solidified his paranoia and his conviction that he was a man of destiny, protected by fate. The reprisals were brutal, leading to the execution of thousands of opponents. The last months of his life were spent sealed in the Führer bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, issuing orders to phantom armies, watching his dream of a 1,000-year Reich crumble around him. On April 30th, 1945, with the Soviet army only blocks away, Adolf Hitler, having married his longtime mistress Eva Braun the day before, committed suicide by a combination of cyanide and a gunshot to the head. His body and that of Braun were immediately burned in the Chancellery Garden, a final act of paranoid precaution to prevent the Soviets from displaying his corpse. Epilogue: The shadow remains. Adolf Hitler's narrative is not simply a chronicle of ambition and military conquest. It is a profound cautionary tale about the power of resentment, the manipulation of mass fear, and the catastrophic consequence of unchecked ideological hatred. The most astonishing fact of his life is not that he rose from nothing, but that the world, repeatedly warned by his own words, failed to stop him until the cost was too high to comprehend. The historical record is clear. He was an Austrian corporal, a failed artist, a man consumed by personal insecurity who mastered the dark art of propaganda and harnessed the desperation of a nation. He remains the ultimate symbol of human depravity, a reminder that the greatest evils can often be perpetrated by the most surprising and ultimately pathetic of men. His legacy is etched in the memory of the Holocaust, the ruins of Europe, and the millions of unmarked graves that stand as silent witnesses to the ghost of Brauna.